Rain hammered the pavement outside the store, but inside, the air crackled with tension. A man in his 60s, gray hair peeking from under a worn cap, stood trembling in the middle of the crowded aisle. His voice shook as he yelled, "You can't kick him out, he's a veteran, and that's his service dog." The manager, a beefy guy with a red face, loomed over him, spitting orders. "Get out, or you're fired." The old veteran nearby leaned on a cane, his weathered hand gripping the leash of a golden retriever with a service vest. His eyes held a quiet pain, like he'd seen this fight before. The dog sat still, ears twitching. Customers stared, some whispering, others filming. The man didn't back down, but in seconds, security grabbed his arms, dragging him toward the door. The manager shouted, "You're done here." Out in the rain, jobless and soaked, he wondered if standing up was worth it. He didn't see the figure in the shadows, a tall man in a Marine uniform, watching silently. This wasn't the end. It was just the start. The rain hadn't let up by the time he trudged home, his boots sloshing through puddles on the cracked sidewalk. His thin jacket clung to his shoulders, heavy and cold, but his mind was heavier. He kept seeing it all, the manager's red face, the veteran's shaky grip on that cane, the way the crowd just gawked like it was some show. He'd worked that store job for 6 months, ringing up groceries, stocking shelves, nothing fancy. At 63, he didn't have much else. Retirement from the mechanic shop years back left him with a small savings, but it was dwindling fast. Now this. He pushed open the door to his little apartment, a one-bedroom place with faded wallpaper and a creaky floor. The silence hit him hard. No one waited for him anymore, not since his wife passed 3 years ago. He dropped his wet cap on the table and sank into a chair, staring at her picture on the wall. She smiled back, frozen in time, her gray curls framing a face full of warmth. "What would you think of me now?" he muttered. Standing up for that veteran felt right in the moment, but losing the job? He wasn't so sure. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The storm rattled the windows, and his thoughts raced. He'd seen the veteran's dog, calm and steady, like it knew more than anyone there. And the veteran himself, those tired eyes carried a story, one he hadn't told. The man wondered if he'd ever see him again. By morning, the rain stopped, but a gray gloom hung over the town. He brewed coffee, strong and black, and sat sipping it when he heard voices outside. Peeking through the blinds, he saw neighbors huddled, talking low. "Heard about the guy at the store," one said. "Got canned for sticking up for some old vet." Another nodded. "Manager's a piece of work." Word traveled fast in a place like this, a small town where everyone knew your business. He didn't care much for gossip, but it stung knowing they saw him as the guy who got fired. He wasn't a hero, just a fool who opened his mouth. Around noon, he shuffled to the mailbox, expecting bills. Instead, he found a plain envelope, no name, no return address. His fingers hesitated before tearing it open. Inside was a short note, typed neat, "You did the right thing. We'll make it right." In the corner, a small stamp, a military eagle, wings spread. His heart skipped. Who sent this? He turned the paper over, looking for clues, but there was nothing else. The words stuck with him, though, "We'll make it right." Who was we? He stuffed the letter in his pocket and stepped outside, the air crisp and damp. The street was quiet, kids at school, folks at work. He wasn't one of them anymore. Jobless at his age felt like a punch to the gut. He'd fixed engines for 30 years, big rigs, cars, even a tractor once. His hands still knew the work, but the world didn't seem to need him now. As he walked to the corner store for a paper, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. He glanced back, nothing but empty porches and a stray cat darting under a car. Maybe it was just the letter messing with his head. Back home, he spread the newspaper out, skimming headlines about gas prices and local elections. Nothing about the store incident, thank God. He didn't need that kind of attention. But the letter sat there on the table, staring at him. Military stamp. A promise. It felt like a lifeline, or a trap. By evening, he'd made up his mind. He'd find that veteran, ask what he knew. Maybe the old man had answers about this wee business. He didn't have much left to lose, just a quiet life that wasn't so quiet anymore. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through his window, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years: purpose. His wife's picture caught the light, and he swore her smile grew a little. "Guess I'm not done yet," he said to her, voice soft. Whatever came next, he'd face it head-on. The next morning, he couldn't sit still. That letter with the military stamp burned a hole in his pocket, and the veteran's face, those tired, haunted eyes, kept flashing in his mind. He had to find him. After a quick coffee, he grabbed his jacket and headed out, the air cool and sharp against his face. The town wasn't big, but it had its corners where people hid away. He figured the veteran wasn't the type to live in a fancy house with a picket fence. A guy like that, with a service dog and a cane, probably kept to himself. He started at the store where it all went down, but the manager was there, barking at some kid mopping the floor. No point asking him. Instead, he wandered toward the edge of town, past the gas station and the diner where old-timers swapped stories over greasy eggs. Someone there might know something. He stepped inside, the bell jingling, and a few gray heads turned his way. "Looking for a fella with a service dog," he said, keeping it casual. A guy in a flannel shirt nodded toward the window. "Saw him out by the trailer park, near the old mill road." That was enough. He drove his beat-up pickup down the winding road, past rusted signs and overgrown weeds. The trailer park came into view, rows of weathered homes, some with tarps flapping in the breeze. He spotted the golden retriever first, lying on a patchy lawn, ears perked. Then the veteran, sitting in a folding chair, tossing bits of food from a can to the dog. The old man looked up, squinting, as the truck rolled to a stop. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said, voice rough like gravel. He climbed out, hands in his pockets, feeling a little awkward. "Just wanted to check on you," he said. The veteran grunted, patting the dog's head. "I'm fine." "He's fine. You didn't need to lose your job over it." There was guilt in his tone, but something else too, gratitude, maybe. They sat there, the veteran in his chair, him on an old crate, the dog between them. The silence stretched until he finally asked, "What's your story? You and that dog?" The veteran stared at the ground, his fingers tightening on his cane. "Was a Marine," he said after a long pause. "Long time ago. Lost the leg in a fight overseas. This guy," he nodded at the dog, "keeps me steady. Senses when I'm about to lose it." He tapped his head, hinting at something deeper, something dark. "Panic comes on quick sometimes. Memories I can't shake." His voice dropped low, like he was afraid the words might escape too far. He listened, feeling the weight of it. He'd known guys like this back in his mechanic days, vets who'd seen too much, carried it quiet. "What kind of memories?" he pressed, gentle but curious. The veteran's jaw tightened. "A mission. Bad one. Things went wrong, and he stopped, eyes darting away. "Doesn't matter. It's done." But it wasn't done, not really. The way he said it, the way his hand shook, told a different story. Something was buried there, something he was ashamed of. The dog whined softly, nudging the veteran's leg, and the old man forced a smile. "He knows when I'm getting worked up. Saved me more times than I can count." They talked a bit more, about the weather, the town, nothing heavy. But as he got up to leave, he felt the veteran's guard was still up, like a wall he couldn't climb. "Thanks for what you did," the old man called after him. "Most folks wouldn't." Walking back to his truck, he mulled it over. A mission gone wrong. Shame. That dog wasn't just a helper, it was a lifeline. He slid into the driver's seat, ready to pull away, when he caught a glint in his rearview mirror. A car, dark with tinted windows, sat parked a ways down the road. He hadn't noticed it before. His pulse quickened. Military plates, same eagle stamp as the letter. Someone was watching. Not just watching the veteran, watching him too. He drove off, heart thumping, glancing back every few seconds. The car didn't follow, but it didn't need to. It was there, waiting. The letter's words echoed, "We'll make it right." Who was we? And what did they want with him? By the time he got home, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows. He locked the door, something he rarely bothered to do. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A few days passed, and he tried to keep busy, tinkering with an old radio in his apartment, brewing coffee, walking the block to clear his head. But that car with the tinted windows lingered in his thoughts, and the veteran's half-told story gnawed at him. He'd seen tough times himself, losing his wife, scraping by on odd jobs, but this felt different. Bigger. Like he'd kicked a hornet's nest without knowing it. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, a sharp knock rattled his door. He opened it slow, cautious, and there stood a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a war movie. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from years of hard choices. He wore a Marine uniform, crisp and dark green, medals glinting on his chest. Gray hair peeked from under his cap, but his eyes were sharp, alive. "Afternoon," the man said, voice steady. "Mind if I come in?" He didn't wait for an answer, stepping past like he owned the place. The room felt smaller with him in it. He sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, while the older man hovered near the counter, unsure. "I'm a commander," the stranger said. "Heard what happened at the store. You stood up for one of my own. That means something." His tone was warm but firm, like a teacher praising a kid who'd surprised him. "Thank you." He nodded, still thrown off. "Just did what felt right. Didn't plan on losing my job over it." The commander chuckled, a dry sound. "Most don't plan on being decent. That's why it matters." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I've got work for you, if you're interested. Fixing vehicles, old military ones. Jeeps, trucks, that sort of thing." "You were a mechanic, right?" That caught him off guard. "How'd you know that?" The commander's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Word gets around. Plus, I asked." He didn't elaborate, and the older man didn't push. The offer hung there, tempting but strange. Steady work sounded good, God knew he needed the money, but something about this felt off. Too neat, too fast. "Where's the catch?" he asked, crossing his arms. "No catch," the commander said. "Just a job. Starts Monday, if you're in." He stood, towering again, and handed over a card with an address scribbled on it. "Think it over. But I'll tell you this, you remind me of why I signed up all those years ago. Honor's rare these days." Then he was gone, boots echoing down the hall, leaving the older man staring at the card like it might bite him. That night, sleep didn't come easy. He sat up late, the card on the table next to his wife's picture. Honor. The word stuck with him. He'd spent his life fixing things, engines, mostly, but sometimes people too. Helping a neighbor with a busted carburetor, lending a buck when someone was short. Small stuff. Standing up at the store wasn't small, though. It cost him. Now this commander shows up, talking like it was some big deal. He didn't feel like a hero, just an old fool with a loud mouth. Around midnight, he dozed off in his chair, the card still in hand. Dreams crept in, loud and jumbled. Engines roared, metal clanged, and somewhere in the haze, he heard gunfire, sharp pops that made his chest tighten. He saw the veteran's face, younger, screaming orders in a jungle thick with smoke. Then the commander, standing over a pile of wrecked jeeps, staring at him like he was waiting for something. He jolted awake, heart pounding, the room dark and still. The clock read 3 a.m. He stumbled to the sink, splashing cold water on his face. Dreams didn't usually hit him like that, not since his wife got sick. Back then, he'd dream of losing her over and over, waking up to the real thing. This was different. Felt real, like a warning. He looked out the window, half expecting that car with the tinted windows. Nothing but streetlights and shadows. Still, his gut churned. The job wasn't just a job. The commander wasn't just some do-gooder. Something tied this to the veteran, to that letter, to the mess he'd walked into. By morning, he'd decided. He'd take the job, not because he trusted it, but because he had to know. The commander's words about honor echoed, mixing with the veteran's shame and that mysterious "we" from the note. He'd spent too many years playing it safe, coasting through a quiet life that didn't feel alive anymore. Whatever this was, it was a chance to do more than just get by. He owed that much to himself, and maybe to the wife who'd always believed he could. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Monday morning came fast, and he found himself driving to the address on the commander's card. It was a dusty lot on the edge of town, fenced in with chain link and topped with barbed wire. A faded sign read military storage, but the place looked more like a graveyard for old machines. Jeeps and trucks sat in rows, rusted and dented, relics from wars he'd only read about. He parked his pickup near a metal shed, grabbed his toolbox from the bed, and stepped out into the cool air. The commander was already there, waiting by the door, hands clasped behind his back. "Glad you came," the commander said, nodding toward the shed. "Works inside. Start with the Jeep in the corner, needs a new carburetor." He didn't waste words, and that suited the older man fine. He'd always liked jobs where his hands did the talking. Inside, the shed smelled of oil and metal, a familiar comfort. The Jeep was a beast, olive green, scratched up, with a hood that groaned when he popped it. He got to work, losing himself in the rhythm of bolts and wrenches, the hum of an engine coming back to life. Days turned into a week, then two. The commander stopped by often, watching him tinker, sometimes asking about his old mechanic days. "Fixed a lot of rigs in my time," he'd say, wiping grease off his hands. "Big ones, small ones. Kept me sane after my wife passed." The commander nodded, like he understood more than he let on. "Lost as that," he said once. "Makes you find something to hold on to." It was the closest they got to personal, but it felt real. Then came the hints. The commander started dropping odd comments, stuff like "these vehicles saw action" or "some stories never get told right." One afternoon, while he was under a truck swapping an oil pan, he heard the commander on the phone outside. The words were muffled, but a few cut through: "the vet, cover up, metal." His ears perked up. He slid out, pretending to grab a rag, and caught the tail end, something about "fixing it now." The commander hung up quick, glancing his way, but didn't say a word. That night, he pieced it together over a cup of coffee at his kitchen table. The veteran's shame, the mission gone wrong, the commander's interest, it wasn't random. That metal talk stuck with him. Had the veteran done something heroic, something the military buried? And why was the commander here, digging it up? The job felt less like charity now and more like a thread in a bigger web. He remembered the car with tinted windows, the letter promising to make it right. This wasn't just about fixing trucks. The next day, he tested the waters. While tightening a fan belt, he asked casual-like, "These vehicles got history, huh? Ever meet the guys who rode an M?" The commander paused, oil can in hand. "Some," he said. "Good men. Deserved better than they got." His voice had an edge, like he was holding back a storm. "You ever know a Marine with a service dog?" the older man pushed. The commander's eyes flicked up, sharp. "Might have." "Why?" "Just curious," he lied, turning back to the engine. But his heart thumped. The commander knew the veteran had to. This special project wasn't about Jeeps, it was about the past. Maybe righting a wrong. He thought of the veteran feeding his dog scraps, living in that trailer, carrying a weight no one saw. What if the commander was here to lift it? And what if he'd been pulled in to help? By Friday, the tension thickened. He caught the commander staring at a photo taped inside a truck's cab, 3 young Marines, grinning, one with a face that could have been the veteran decades back. "Old crew?" he asked, nodding at it. The commander ripped it down, stuffing it in his pocket. Yeah. Old crew. He walked off, leaving the older man with a chill. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling he'd stumbled into something dangerous. A cover-up meant secrets. And secrets meant trouble. But there was another side, pride, maybe even justice. Fixing engines was one thing. Fixing a man's life? That was bigger. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his wife's picture glowing in the moonlight. She'd loved when he took risks, not dumb ones, but the kind that mattered. Standing up at the store was a risk. This job was too. Whatever the commander was chasing, he was part of it now. Dangerous or not, he wouldn't walk away. Not yet. The days at the garage rolled on, but the air felt heavier now. He'd caught the commander's game, something about the veteran, a medal, a buried truth, but he kept his head down, wrench in hand, waiting for the next move. It came on a windy afternoon, the kind where dust swirled around the lot like ghosts. He was tightening a lug nut on a Jeep when a familiar voice cut through the noise. Well, look who's playing soldier now. He turned, and there stood the store manager, arms crossed, smirking like he'd won something. The older man straightened up, wiping grease on his pants. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice steady but tight. The manager stepped closer, his bulk filling the space. "Heard you landed on your feet. Didn't sit right with me. You don't get to make a fool of me and walk away clean." His tone dripped with venom, and a few workers nearby stopped, tools clanking quiet. A crowd was forming, vets in faded caps, guys from the garage, even a couple kids on bikes peeking through the fence. Before he could answer, the commander appeared, boots crunching gravel. "Problem here," he said, calm but cold. The manager sneered. "This clown got me laughed at. Thinks he's some hero 'cause he stuck up for a cripple and his mutt." The words hit like a punch, and the older man clenched his fists. "Watch your mouth," he warned. The manager laughed, loud and mean. "Or what? You'll cry to your new boss?" That's when it snapped. The older man stepped forward, voice rising. "You're a bully. Always were. Kicking out a vet 'cause you're too thick to see what matters." The crowd murmured, heads nodding. The manager's face reddened, but the commander raised a hand, silencing them both. "Enough," he said, then turned to the group. "You want to know what this is about? I'll tell you." He pulled a medal from his pocket, bronze, worn, with a ribbon faded to gray. "This belongs to a Marine," he said, loud enough for everyone. "A man who saved his squad in a fight no one talks about. Took a hit, lost his leg, and the brass covered it up to save a general's hide. He's been living with that shame ever since." The older man's breath caught. He knew who this was about. The commander kept going. "You all know him. Lives out by the mill road. Has a dog that keeps him going." The manager scoffed. "What's that got to do with anything?" The commander's eyes locked on him. "This man," he pointed at the older guy, "stood up for him when you wouldn't. That's honor. Something you wouldn't understand." Then he turned, handing the medal to the older man. "Take this to him. Tell him it's time." The crowd went quiet, the weight of it sinking in. The manager sputtered, "You're all nuts," and stormed off, kicking gravel as he went. No one followed. The older man held the medal, its edges digging into his palm. Pride swelled in his chest, mixed with something raw, relief, maybe. He'd been part of this without even knowing. The commander clapped his shoulder. "You did good," he said, voice low. "Finish up here. We'll settle the rest soon." The workers drifted back to their jobs, but the air buzzed. He slipped the medal in his pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. Driving home, he replayed it all, the manager's tantrum, the commander's stand, the medal story. He'd never been one for crowds or speeches, but today felt different. He'd stood his ground again, and this time, it wasn't just him. It was for the veteran, for the truth. The sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, and he smiled a little, thinking of his wife. She'd have loved this mess, cheered him on, probably. But then he saw it in his rearview mirror, that car with tinted windows, trailing a few lengths back. His stomach twisted. It had been watching since the trailer park, maybe before. He sped up, taking a side road, then another. The car followed, steady, not hiding anymore. His hands gripped the wheel, pulse racing. Whoever they weren't done with him. The commander's special project wasn't over, and neither was the danger. He pulled into his lot, the car idling down the street, just sitting there. He locked his doors that night, the metal on the table, glinting like a warning. Tomorrow, he'd find the veteran. But tonight, he felt the walls closing in, the night dragged on, restless and tense. He barely slept, the car with tinted windows haunting his thoughts. By morning, he'd had enough. He grabbed the metal, stuffed it in his jacket, and headed out, determined to end this, whatever this was. The car wasn't there when he checked the street, but that didn't ease the knot in his gut. He drove to the trailer park, the metal heavy in his pocket, his mind set on finding the veteran and getting answers. The old man was outside, same as before, feeding his dog from a can. The golden retriever wagged its tail as he approached, but the veteran's eyes narrowed. "You again," he said, voice gruff. "What now?" He didn't waste time. "Got something for you," he said, pulling out the metal. The veteran froze, staring at it like it might burn him. "Where'd you get that?" he rasped. "Commander gave it to me. Said it's yours. Said it's time." The veteran's hand shook as he took it, turning it over, tracing the ribbon. "Shouldn't be mine," he muttered. "Not after what happened." Before he could ask more, a car rolled up, the same one with tinted windows. He braced himself, but the door opened, and out stepped a man in a wrinkled suit, gray hair thin, face lined with regret. "Been a long time," the stranger said to the veteran, voice soft. The older man stepped back, watching. "Who are you?" he demanded. The stranger sighed. "Used to be an officer. Was there when it went wrong. Been tracking him down ever since." He nodded at the veteran. "Mission got messy. He saved us, took the hit, but the higher-ups pinned it on him to save their skins. I stayed quiet too long." The veteran glared, but his eyes glistened. "You should have said something back then," he snapped. The officer nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here." They stood there, the three of them, the dog nudging the veteran's leg like it sensed the storm inside him. The older man spoke up. "Commander told me the truth. Said you deserved better. This," he pointed at the medal, "proves it." The officer pulled out a folded flag from his car. "Thought we could do it right this time," he said. "Small thing. Just us." The veteran looked away, jaw tight, but didn't say no. By afternoon, they'd set it up, a quiet spot near the trailer, a folding table, the flag spread out. The commander showed up, uniform crisp, and a handful of vets from the garage trickled in, drawn by word of mouth. No big speeches, just the officer telling the story straight, a firefight, a young Marine dragging his squad to safety, a blast that took his leg. "He got blamed," the officer said, voice breaking. "But he's the reason I'm here." He handed the flag to the veteran, who took it slow, hands trembling. The commander saluted, sharp and steady, and the others followed, ragged, imperfect, but real. The older man joined in, chest tight with something he couldn't name. The veteran's eyes welled up, but he didn't cry. He just clutched the flag and medal, staring at them like they might vanish. "Didn't think anyone remembered," he said, almost to himself. The dog pressed against him, steady as ever. After, they lingered, coffee from a thermos, quiet talk about old times. The officer apologized again, and the veteran nodded, not forgiving exactly, but letting it go. The older man watched, feeling the pieces settle. That day at the store, yelling at the manager, losing his job, it started this. He hadn't planned it, hadn't known it'd lead here, but it did. Justice, late and rough, but real. Driving home, he felt lighter. The car with tinted windows was gone for good, its shadow lifted. He stopped by the garage, dropping off the last Jeep keys, and the commander met him there. "You kicked it off," the commander said. "Standing up like that. Took guts." He shrugged, sheepish. "Just got mad, is all." The commander smiled. "Sometimes that's enough." Back at his apartment, he sat at the table, the day replaying in his head. His wife's picture caught the light, and he swore she was there, whispering he'd done good. He thought of the veteran smiling, first time he'd seen it, and the lesson hit him clear. Life's about standing up, even when it's late, even when it's hard. You don't always see the end, but it matters anyway. At 63, job or no job, he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And that felt like enough.